Erstmal frohe Weihnachten an alle und herzlich willkommen zu dieser Reaction auf etwas, was ich schon seit längerem verfolge. How we built all of Breath of the Wild in Minecraft. Und das ist das finale Video. Er ist fertig, er hat es geschafft. Und ich habe auf die einzelnen nicht reagiert, aber ich möchte jetzt auf die komplette Zusammenfassung reagieren, weil ich möchte den Prozess wissen. Ich möchte den Prozess wissen. Heute am schönen 24.12. Bescherung war schon längst gefressen, habe ich alles. Und jetzt darf ich genießen. Und zwar von Grazi, das jetzt schon mal ein Like bekommt. Weil ich habe das Projekt wirklich schon verfolgt und das ist wirklich einfach nur geil. Und jetzt lasst uns alle ganz viel enjoyen.
It's 2020. During the lockdown, I was completely bored with nothing to do. So, I started
Ja, das ging vielen im Lockdown so.
making Minecraft videos. My channel began to
Oh,
steadily
Lockdown war so geil. Können wir nochmal drauf zurückschauen. Ich hasse jeden Menschen, der sich drüber aufregt. Lockdown, wir waren so eingeschränkt. Wir mussten uns impfen. Also Lockdown war die geilste Zeit aller Zeiten. Wer sich da aufregt, der ist scheiße einfach.
grow as I worked on all kinds of builds in my hardcore world.
Ich habe heute im Übrigen speziell für den Anlass diese speziellen Oreos White and Robbed Ultra Ungesund Edition purer Zucker am Start. Die habe ich heute am Start. Für nebenbei ist es eine Stunde. Ich werde hier essen und trinken und ja, was weiß ich, Sachen machen halt.
But after 2 years of this, I got bored. So, I pulled out an old idea that I had in the back of my brain for a few months.
Ah, okay, ich verstehe schon. Ihm ist langweilig während Corona geworden und deshalb hat er gestartet. Okay. Well. Ja, da sehe ich. Ich kann ihn sehr gut nachvollziehen. Corona war so geil, ey. Ich habe so viel Animal Crossing gespielt, ich habe so viel Minecraft gespielt, ich habe so viel. Oh, Corona. Ey, wann gibt's endlich Corona 2? Wann?
What if I built all of Breath of the Wild in Minecraft?
So geil, so geil. Man muss die langsam essen, weil die muss man genießen, wirklich. Weil sind die geil, scheiße. Das ist purer Zucker.
I had put this idea off for so long because of one
Und man muss die auch so festhalten, also mit der Verpackung, weil sonst ist die ganze Hand voll mit Schokolade. Wirklich, innerhalb von wenigen Sekunden voll mit Schokolade. Man muss die so ganz langsam abbeißen. Genießen. Und währenddessen haltet man sie mit dem hier fest. Das ist ganz, ganz wichtig. Egal, gehen wir zurück zum Video.
simple reason. It's impossible. Replicating every patch of ruins, every settlement, every guardian, that would be hard enough on its own. But how would I even replicate the terrain of Hyrule itself? Breath of the Wild's landscape is massive, making it near impossible to build on its own, especially for somebody who has no creative mode building experience. But I had an idea. I downloaded this software called World Painter that allows you to literally paint your own Minecraft terrain. I plan to use this to
ich weiß nicht, ob er das schon mal in einem Video erklärt hat, wie das mit dem Terrain vonstatten ging. Auf jeden Fall weiß ich es nicht mehr. Jetzt bin ich gespannt, wie man das gelöst hat.
But even with this software, it still wouldn't be easy. Perfectly mimicking the terrain of Hyrule with nothing but a paintbrush that raises terrain just would not be easy. Hey, what's this button do? Import from height map? I guess I'll click it and upload a height map of Hyrule that I found online. Oh my god! The entire terrain of Hyrule. Done. Just like that. What I thought would be the hardest part of the
So einfach, so schnell. Das war alles. Es gibt eine Height Map von Hyrule. Also keine Ahnung, wo man sowas findet, aber cool.
This project was complete in the blink of an eye. Maybe I can actually do this. maybe I can actually... No. Are you crazy? Even with this terrain done, this was still a gigantic project. I would have to build every divine beast, every settlement, including this intricate monster. I would have to scour every forest for details and explore the deepest corners of Hyrule to perfectly replicate every... I started by filling in all of the rivers and lakes around Hyrule and fixing up parts of the terrain that were inaccurate. I had to remove snow from certain areas and add the correct blocks into some places, such as the sand on the beach. After importing the world into Minecraft and exploring it for the first time, I began to notice that the height map I used wasn't exactly perfect. But I don't have to deal with those problems yet.
Aber ich glaube, damit hat er auch nicht gerechnet, dass es perfekt ist.
That's an issue for future me to figure out. Now that I had a bare-bones map of Hyrule in Minecraft, I can move on to step 2. Build literally everything else.
Passt
Yeah, I was a little bit intimidated.
A Desolated World, Chapter 1.
Where do I even start? Do I just pick a spot and start building? That felt weird. To me, it made sense to start from the Great Plateau, right where Breath of the Wild first begins. But I needed some basic templates first. There are all kinds of structures across Hyrule that repeat themselves, such as Sheikah Towers, shrines, and of course, trees. I wanted to get some of these built up first, since I would need them for the Great Plateau. I finished up the Sheikah Tower after tampering with the scale a bunch, before moving on to the shrines. I do like how this first shrine design turned out, but it ended up being way too big, so I would have to redo it later. The last of the Sheikah tech that I would build up were the Guardians, which did take a lot of trial and error, but I'm extremely happy with how they turned out in the end.
Ich habe lustigerweise auch ein Guardian-Design. Ich habe immer mal wieder in ein paar Welten von mir, in Minecraft, ein paar Guardians gebaut. Meine sah tatsächlich ganz anders aus, also wirklich. Das ist das Design, mit dem er gegangen ist. Nee, ich hab das mit Andesit ein bisschen sehr anders gemacht. Ich weiß jetzt aber nicht mehr genau, wie. Ich denke, sie waren auch nicht so ganz akkurat, die ich gemacht habe, aber vielleicht finde ich noch irgendwo ein Bild, dann kann ich das zeigen. Dafür müsste ich auf die scheiß Nintendo Switch Edition, oder besser gesagt auf die Bedrock Edition auf der Nintendo Switch. Ja, das wird ein Krampf.
And error, but I'm extremely happy with
Aber
how
vielleicht
it turned
finde
out
ich's
in the end. The landscape of Hyrule is also dotted with a variety of different trees, so I decided to build the 3 main variants that I would need for the Great Plateau. The pine trees turned out quite well in my opinion, and the oak trees were alright considering that I was trying to mimic the lollipop tree style from the game. But looking back, I'm not as happy with how these birch trees turned out. Turning my eyes to the Great Plateau itself, the first thing I wanted to build were the massive ruinous walls surrounding the region. Despite already building the towers and shrines, this felt like the first true build of the project. But because I didn't have much...
Nimmt auch echt einfach die geile Soundtracks aus Zelda generell hier für den Background, das fühle ich.
Experience as a builder, working on the diagonal angles was difficult, forcing me to abuse World Edit's rotate command to finish the walls. Once the walls were in place, I went through each one to add cracks and holes in the structure to replicate the ruined look from Breath of the Wild. After adding in all of the trees on the plateau and implementing the snowy mountainous region, it was time to scour the Great Plateau and add every tiny detail from the game. I started with the Shrine of Resurrection since it's the location where Link's journey first begins. Since I had already found a palette for the Sheikah technology, it went pretty fast. And moving back outside across the Great Plateau, there wasn't much in the area aside from some small patches of ruins.
Aber sehr smart, die generell allgemeinen Buildings schon mal zuerst zu bauen, erspart einen dann im Nachhinein umso mehr Zeit.
One of the most important...
Wenn man immer ein Template für die hat, ne? Ich meine, die hat er wahrscheinlich irgendwo ganz weit weg schweben und die kann er dann einfach mit so World Edit, keine Ahnung wie das genau funktioniert, aber irgendwie so kann er es dann rüber kopieren, ganz einfach immer. Ich weiß nicht, wie es genau funktioniert. Es ist nur, wie es in meinem Kopf funktionieren könnte, eventuell. Ich rate hier mit. Ich glaube, ich bin ein Laie im Creative World Building. Im professionellen Creative World Building.
Builds on the plateau was the Bokoblin Skull Camp. There are dozens of these things all across Hyrule, so by building one camp, I had essentially built a majority of them all across Hyrule. The bomb shrine went pretty fast, and so did the old man's hut. The snowy region of the plateau didn't have a lot to build, but I would have to do my first minor terraforming task to fix up the peak of Mount Hylia, since it looked a bit off before. But there was still one massive build on the plateau that I had been avoiding, the Temple of Time. As I started on the ruins outside of the temple, it began to feel like the first big build of the project. A milestone that marked the end of the beginning.
Also da gibt es sehr viel Sinn, vor allem am Start von so einem Riesenprojekt sowas direkt zu avoiden. Weil vor allem Tempel der Zeit hat man hohe Erwartungen.
Of the project.
Ich weiß gar nicht, ob er das alles nochmal überarbeiten wird, aber ich erinnere mich, dass er immer mal wieder Sachen überarbeitet hat, die er dann im Nachhinein nicht mehr so gefeiert hat.
Super tough to get a design down for the temple that I was happy with, and I had to constantly mess with the scale to get it to look right. But after finishing the central tower, the two other towers came together a lot faster. I just had to finish up the pointed roofs once they were all complete. The back of the temple was a lot easier to build up, so I moved swiftly on to the interior. The temple has a wide open interior, so there wasn't a whole lot of work to do on the inside, except for the goddess statue in the back. I usually suck at building small-scale statues like this, but somehow I brought this one together pretty quickly, and I really like how it turned out. But with the Temple of Time complete, I had officially built...
Ich weiß nicht, was der eine Steinknopf sein soll. Ich glaube nicht, dass das die Augen widerspiegeln soll. Ich meine, die Statue hatte Augen. Aber warte, ich check schon. Oder nee, ich check doch nicht. Nee, ich erkenne bei der Statue relativ wenig. Ich weiß nicht mehr, wie sie im Original ausgesehen hat, aber anhand dieses Buildings kann ich mir auch nicht weit mehr drunter vorstellen.
And I really like how it turned out. But with the Temple of Time complete, I had officially built the entire Great Plateau. That went pretty fast.
Das kleinste Gebiet in ganz Breath of the Wild.
Fast, right? With this kind of progress, we should be able to finish the project pretty quick. Until you realize that while I did go over this whole build pretty quickly, it actually took a month and a half to build. I still had very minimal building experience, and as a result, I had to do most of the Great Plateau by hand. Despite the slower than expected start, I was still hoping to have this project done by the end of the year. Spoiler alert, it took a little bit longer than that. At this point, I finally had enough content to make a YouTube video about this and reveal this project to the world. On March 17th, 2022, episode 1 officially went live. After 2 weeks, the video had amassed about 3,000 views before dying off, and it almost entirely stopped getting views. With college starting in the fall, I would not be able to balance school with a job as well as YouTube. So I was hoping that I could make YouTube into my job now so that I would only have to balance 2 things, which would be more reasonable. But after 2 months of hard work, it hadn't paid off.
Oh.
And on top of that, an
Aber das
even
wird es
bigger
noch.
issue arose. When I began scouting out the rest of Hyrule for my next video, a terrible realization hit me when I reached Kakariko Village.
Okay.
It was too small. There wasn't nearly enough room to fit an entire village here. You might be thinking, well, just expand the area to give yourself more room then. But it wasn't that simple. Remember, I generated the world using an actual height map of Hyrule. So, if this was too small...
Und die Height Map wird jetzt zum Problem.
Everything else would be too. I did a thorough check of the map, and sure enough, it was obvious. The map was too small, with the only real solution being to restart the entire map.
Oh, Scheiße!
The month and a half that I spent on the Great Plateau would be for nothing. Facing that reality...
Oh, das hittet gleich doppelt, weil wie er sagt, er hatte Stress wegen Studium und das noch dazu. Und dann wurde dieses erste Video nicht mal so erfolgreich. Scheiße. Was hat ihn jetzt noch motiviert, ist die Frage.
As well as my own perceived failure with the first episode, beat me down pretty hard. So, I quit YouTube.
Nicht ganz.
By the end of May, the video had strangely begun to pick up views again, and was already north of 10,000 views. This wasn't enough for me to return to YouTube, but I was not prepared for the incoming storm. This is what happened during the first 2 weeks of June.
Oh, well, ja, das ist halt der Algorithmus. Irgendwann kommt er dann doch. Von hinten angeschlichen, aber er kommt irgendwann.
Out of absolutely nowhere, the video exploded. During this week, the video gained over 500,000 views. On June 7th, I was at 2,400 subscribers. 2 weeks later, I had added 30,000 to that number. You know, this might be enough to make into a job. This unexpected blow-up caught me completely off guard. To this day, I still have no idea what actually caused it. But with summer break just starting, I figured it was time to return to the project. I didn't care that I had...
Wahrscheinlich war es die Vorfreude auf Tears of the Kingdom. 2022 im Juni, oder wann war's? Es war Juni 2022. War da die Nintendo Direct? Weil ich meine, ich habe von diesem Projekt auch erst mitbekommen, wo Tears of the Kingdom schon angeteasert wird. Noch nicht namentlich, aber da bin ich mir aber nicht sicher.
To restart anymore because I suddenly had hundreds of thousands of people waiting for the next episode. If it wasn't for the outpouring of support that I got from you guys, I probably would have committed to quitting YouTube and would never have finished this project. But now, well, I just can't keep everyone waiting. I'm back.
Jetzt geht's los. Jetzt startet's erst richtig.
First things first, I needed to figure out how to tackle the restart of the map. I dug through my old files and found the dusty old map that I used the first time. I re-imported it into World Painter, making sure that the scale was bigger this time, fixed up the messy bits, and put it into Minecraft. Now, this scale is going to work. A lot of my builds from the first attempt would still work on the new scale, so I could just transfer everything over to the new world and reuse them.
Es ist ja
It was still a
trotzdem
pain to put everything back in place, and there were some things that I had to redo, such as the Great Plateau walls. But after some very annoying, very grindy work, it was...
Er konnte ein, zwei Sachen wiederverwenden, aber trotzdem wird es alles andere trotzdem überarbeitet werden und das ist sehr viel Arbeit.
Done. And now that you can see them side by side, it's clear that the first version was way too small. At this point, I also met fellow YouTuber Hauziki, who was coding a data pack to add all of Breath of the Wild's game features into Minecraft. His data pack is going to be implemented into my map when it is finished, so be sure to check out his channel in the description if you want to catch up on that project.
Okay.
Now, where do we move to next after the Great Plateau?
Auch nicht schlecht.
I decided to follow the path
So ein
that
kleines
most
cooles
new players
Side-Feature.
take through Breath of the Wild. I wanted to head east and build up Kakariko and Hateno Village, and after that, I'd move north to build Zora's Domain. The domain is one of the most incredible pieces of architecture on the map, and it was easily the build that people seemed most excited for. Because of that, the domain became my next massive goal to reach for. But it
Also ich war auch sehr excited damals, wie er das dann tackelt. Ich glaube, es war eine sehr große Herausforderung. Ich möchte jetzt nicht spoilern, aber ich kenne mich schon ein bisschen aus. Ich glaube, es war eine harte Herausforderung für ihn.
So, let's take it step by step and focus on getting to Kakariko Village. The large batch of outpost ruins sit just outside the Great Plateau, so my first task was to build these up. And little did I know that this was actually a massive step forward in the project. Most of these structures are just reused assets that appear all across the map. Take this small structure on the hill, for example. This building appears multiple times in the outpost ruins themselves, but they also appear all over Central Hyrule and even Akala. Some of the buildings here even show up as far as the slopes of Death Mountain. So by finishing this massive batch of ruins, I had effectively already finished a large portion of the ruins across Hyrule. Even this bridge that I had to build next is a reused asset, appearing outside of the Colosseum and Kakariko Village. I was now within view of the Dueling Peaks, an iconic mountain structure from Breath of the Wild. The terrain leading up to the mountain was mostly empty. There was a large tree stump, another Sheikah tower, some enemy camps, which doesn't sound like a lot of work, but considering how inexperienced I still was, it was slow work. There were also plenty of bridges to build up in the area, which were pretty fun to work on, but I did struggle on a couple of them due to the weird angles, since I still did not have much.
Ja, so Seitenbauen in Minecraft ist immer sehr weird, weil aus obvious reasons. Ich meine, schau dir das an, wie er das machen muss. Er muss da ein, warte mal, so sieht man das besser. Immer 1, 2, 1 nach vorne, 1, 2, 1 nach vorne, 1, 2 nach vorne. Überhaupt das so auszurechnen, dass sich das perfekt so ausgeht, ist Ganz, ganz nervig. Da unten macht er dann das zusammen. Ja, also wirklich so seitlich bauen in Minecraft, das ist nicht das Einfachste.
Knowledge about how to work with.
Und das musste er auch wirklich mehrere Male machen, deshalb Respekt, weil das ist, würde ich schon sagen, etwas, wenn ich die Möglichkeit habe, etwas seitlich zu bauen, suche ich immer eine Möglichkeit, es nicht zu tun. Aber er muss es ja tun, weil er wirklich originalgetreu sein möchte.
Different angles. But one of the most tedious tasks at the time was placing in all of the trees.
The method I was using to place trees was pretty simple.
Copy a tree, apply it to 4 different tools with a different rotation on each tool, repeat that with every tree design, filling out the inventory with tools, and then start right-clicking with different tools to put them in place.
Did you get all that?
Obviously, this was super tedious and annoying since I was
Ja, so wie ich meinte tatsächlich. Mit World Edit, aber das gibt doch safe eine einfache Möglichkeit.
literally placing every tree one at a time. But there wasn't any other way for me to do it. As far as I was concerned, I would have to place every tree on the map using this method. But after finishing up the forest, I was on.
Das Problem, was ich hier sehe bei der Methode, er möchte originalgetreu sein. Das heißt, er muss einfach nach. Wahrscheinlich hat er rechts das Gameplay von Breath of the Wild offen oder links oder oben, keine Ahnung, auf welchem Bildschirm er es offen hat. Steht dann da, schaut dann, okay, da ist der Baum, platziert den Baum dann circa genau da, wo er im Game steht. Und das heißt immer nach rechts schauen, zack, klicken. Aber wie optimiert man das?
Dueling peaks. And if you thought the trees sounded like a nightmare, well, buckle yourselves in, because the dueling peaks revealed what was probably the biggest problem with the world of Hyrule. This is what the dueling peaks look like in Breath of the Wild. And here's what they look like on my Minecraft map. So, why does mine look nothing like what it should?
Yeah.
I generated my world using a literal map of Hyrule, so theoretically my terrain should be 100% perfect. However, look at this overhanging cliff. You see how there's air beneath it? Well, how does the two-dimensional map I used know that there's air beneath the surface? Well, it doesn't. Because of this, when I generated the world, any overhanging structures in Hyrule just didn't generate. My dueling peaks look so bad because none of these overhanging rocks generated. And that means I have to build them myself.
That already sounds bad enough when looking at the dueling peaks, but it gets even worse.
There are overhanging cliffs all over Hyrule. Ploymus Mountain, Hebra Peak, Rito Village, Death Mountain.
All of these structures and much more were completely missing because of this overhanging.
Das ist natürlich ein Riesenproblem, weil immer wenn man, weil dann stellt man sich dahin und dann denkt, warum sieht das so komisch aus? Und dann muss man in-game in diese Stelle und dann sieht man, okay, scheiße, ich muss jetzt, ach du Kacke, aber gibt's dafür eine Lösung?
Meaning I would have to terraform all of them myself.
Luckily, with World Edit, I could pretty quickly create structures by placing massive spheres, but it wouldn't be pretty, and I'd have to manually smooth them out, which was super time-consuming. But I had another trick up my sleeve. The problem with this method is that I can pretty much only place massive spheres, which obviously don't look good. But if I place spheres of sand, they would fall to the ground and the structure would naturally smooth itself out because of block gravity. This trick would allow me to quickly terraform lots of rocks that were missing from the map, but this still didn't solve the overhang issue, because obviously the sand falls. But what if I make a massive mound such as this, change the sand to a solid block, and flipped it upside down to get an overhang? This was the method that I used to tackle the dueling peaks, which was definitely the best option I had.
Man wird kreativ. Und da sieht man mal wieder, wenn man verzweifelt eine Lösung braucht, findet man die Antwort, wie auch immer.
At the time, but it still didn't turn out that good. It's nowhere close to being accurate to Breath of the Wild, but for the time being, I moved on and made a mental note to redo them later. On the other side of the dueling peaks, I encountered my first stable, which was definitely a major thing to build up. I was super excited for this, and despite the horse head giving me a bit of trouble, I got there in the end. All stables are identical, so I was able to reuse this design all over Hyrule. And after building up Fort Hateno, I followed the road north to build the first major settlement of the series, Kakariko Village. I started by outlining where every building in town would go, a process that I would do for pretty much every settlement on this map. I designed Impa's house first, which was definitely the most complicated design, but also the most interesting one. This set the block palette that I would use for the rest of the buildings. There were only a couple other house designs across the village, for which the roofs were very tricky to make, but other than that, the buildings weren't too hard. And yes, by the way, I did build every single interior in the town, and I would be doing that for every single building on this map. With the
Sehr
interiors
dedicated.
done, I swept across town to add all of the smaller details to make the town feel more alive, completing the village. But just outside the town was the first Great Fairy Fountain, which I built up with relative ease. Again, all the fountain designs are identical, but I would have to change the color for future designs. With our first major settlement complete, I had taken yet another important step towards my goal of Zora's domain.
Ooh.
While it was tempting to keep moving north into Lanayru, I wanted to finish up the rest of Necluda first.
Ich erinnere mich nicht mehr so an so viel, wie genau er bei Zora's Domain, ob das gepasst hat, ob das anstrengend war oder nicht. Ich weiß nicht mehr, ob er da viel Probleme hatte. Ich meine, beim Dorf schon. Beim Zora Dorf. Aber beim Rest weiß ich gar nicht mehr. Ich bin sehr gespannt.
Which meant we would have to head east from Fort Hateno. I encountered a massive cliff overhang that I would have to build just past Fort Hateno, but unfortunately, due to its weird shape, I couldn't use the upside down sand trick from before. Because of this, I had to manually smooth out the entire thing, which was a massive pain, but it was only a small taste of what I would face in the future. The rest of the Necluda area was pretty empty apart from a Sheikah tower and some small patches of ruins, but again, most of the ruins were just reused assets. For Hateno Village, I once again started by outlining all of the buildings, most of them being on a weird angle that made things a little more tricky. But there were only a few different building designs throughout the village, as most of them were copy-paste, which is going to be a recurring theme throughout this world. The colors and style of these buildings also didn't allow me to get very creative with a block palette. There were a couple of unique buildings in the center of town though, which were my favorite of the bunch. After building the windmills and adding in all of the smaller details around town, the village was complete, apart from the ancient tech lab. Looking back, the lab, or at least the telescope, is something that I'm not too happy with nowadays. But if I start redoing all of these old builds, I would never stop and this project would just continue forever. At this point, 2 entire months had passed since the first video blew up. 5 months since I first posted it. In early August, I finally had enough content to make a sequel to the first video.
Most people seem to assume that I wouldn't continue with this project, let alone finish it, so I'm sure the sight of a second episode was pretty shocking.
My channel got another explosion and my subscriber count doubled, confirming to me that this could actually be my job now.
Which came at a perfect time because despite the smooth sailing so far, a major obstacle had just presented itself. By now, I was just a few weeks away from college, and I knew that dealing with school would give me a lot less time to work on the map.
But for now, my plan was to build my way north and complete Lanayru next, ending off with Zora's domain and my first divine beast of the project, Vah Ruta. Before college began, I did manage to squeeze in Lanayru Promenade, an area just east of Kakariko Village that leads to Mount Lanayru. This was a super fun build to make, despite how tricky it was due to its limiting block palette. But without knowledge of proper commands that could help me, outlining everything.
Aber rein theoretisch, ich meine, wenn er da nochmal drüber schaut, ich weiß gar nicht, ob mittlerweile Blöcke rausgekommen sind, die hier besser passen. Weil es sind dann doch einige Building-Blöcke mit, ich meine, er hat ja 3 Jahre gebaut, da sind dann doch ein paar Building-Blöcke rausgekommen. Aber Minecraft-Updates sind so winzig klein und beschissen. Also ich jedes einzelne Mal ausraste, ihr seht doch jedes Mal meine Reaction auf die Minecraft-Lives, wie ich wirklich jeden von diesen Mojang-Mitarbeitern einzeln und persönlich den Kopf abschlagen möchte, für deren Inkompetentheit ein Update rauszubringen. Selbst wenn die Updates, sie sind ja nicht schlecht, aber es ist halt nix, ne? Stell dir vor, die würden besser und schneller mehr bringen und dann hätte ihr hier keine Probleme mehr mit der Blockpalette. Also überhaupt keine mehr.
Everything by hand was a bit annoying. But it kinda evened out because there were a lot of reused assets in the area. Getting to Mount Lanayru, we encountered our first dragon of the project. Because yes, I did want to build the 3 elemental dragons that you can find roaming across Hyrule.
The only problem is that I suck at making dragons.
This is the only one that I had ever tried to build up until this point, which obviously didn't turn out that great. But luckily for me, right around this time, I saw this guy in my Discord server who had just made an incredible Dinral build. So I DM'd him and was like, I suck at dragons, can you please help me? And he agreed. Hyrath was the first official builder to join me on this project, but there would be a lot more.
Und nicht der letzte, ne? Oh ja, sagt er.
I instructed Hyrath to build Nadra in its corrupted form atop Mount Lanayru, so he got to work pretty quickly. Despite the tight scale, he was able to make the dragon look incredible. With this outlier bit of terrain completed, I moved back west to work on the Lanayru wetlands and follow the road up to Zora's domain. The peak of the mountain was drawing ever closer. The wetlands had small bridges reaching across the water like spiderwebs, with small patches of ruins placed around the various islands. This was the first big batch of wooden-style ruins that I built for the project, but a lot of them would be reused all across Hyrule, just like the outpost ruins.
Since Hyrath had joined to build Nadra, it kind of opened the floodgates for me to invite my other friends to help me build as well. It would be impossible to go over what each builder did at every step of the project, so instead, I'm going to list off all of their major contributions whenever a builder is introduced.
Ghostly would help with rock structures in Lanayru, the dueling peaks, and many more areas of the map, while Alfie would mainly focus on cleaning up blemishes and terrain mistakes all across the world. Ombrain specialized in interiors and smaller details, eventually helping out with nearly every settlement on the map. Ezio helped with a lot of different odd jobs all across Hyrule, and most of the settlements that we'll get to, as well as ensuring that every single Korok puzzle would be placed around the map. These were just the first builders to be added to the project at this point,
Crazy.
and as a team, we moved into Lanayru. The base of Lanayru Tower had some...
Er hat auf jeden Fall schon ein krasses Team hier, ne? Langsam, aber sicher aufgebaut. Dadurch, dass das erste Video plötzlich explodiert ist, wie ich ja schon gesagt habe, meine Theorie, dass es wahrscheinlich irgendwann im Juni 2022 die Nintendo Direct kam, wo dann am Ende dieser letzte coolste Teaser kam. Da bin ich mir nicht mehr ganz sicher, ob das 2022 war im Juni.
Zalfo's camps blocking the road, which was our first build as a team, and the camps turned out quite well. I designed some of the large bones in the area, which would be reused many times around the map, before we moved on to the Sheikah Tower, adding all of the small details around the area. The bridge where you first meet Sidon also sat below the tower, which was the first bit of Zora architecture that I would actually build for the project, setting the block palette for their designs in stone. Moving further along, however, a new problem was presented to us. Across the parts of Hyrule that we've built so far, they all have a simple gray palette for all of the rocks and cliffs of the world. But Lanayru is the first region in which it changes to a subtle blue color.
The problem I had with figuring out block palettes like this is that, well, I'm colorblind.
So oftentimes, I just had to trust other people that the colors we chose looked good, because I literally...
Was war da gerade? Ich bin gerade nebenbei am Recherchieren. Warte. Was?
First region in which it changes to a subtle blue color.
The problem I had with figuring out block palettes like this is that, well, I'm colorblind.
Oh.
So oftentimes...
Okay, das ist Plot-Twist eines Problems, das ich nicht erwartet habe.
I just had to trust other people that the colors we chose looked good, because I literally couldn't trust my own eyeballs with this. We painted all of the cliffs with a lighter blue color, planning to add the darker blue splotches later. We were just within...
So, warte. Legend of the Tears of the Kingdom Official Trailer #1 vor 2 Jahren am, sicher Datum, 13. September. Nee, okay. Das war im September. Und im Juni, glaube ich, kam dieser erste Teaser, wo noch der Name vom Game gar nicht bekannt war und gar nichts. Meine ich zu glauben. Ich recherchiere mal im Hintergrund hier weiter.
In arm's reach of Zora's domain by now. The rest of the road was simple for a while, with only small details here and there, as well as some copy-pasted bridges. But being in the valley of the domain presented a new problem to us. This part of Lanayru has all kinds of protruding rocks and cliffs, and, you guessed it, those are overhangs. we would have to terraform all of these ourselves. This is where the pain of terraforming really set in. It was already super tedious work in Necluda, but now it was on an even larger scale. It was really hard to push through multiple hours of this terraforming work, but we slowly made progress, finishing up the valley and properly coloring in the cliffs. Since I started the project, Zora's Domain was the build that I was most excited for, and it only took 7 months to finally make it here.
But I was super excited to get to work. Little did I know, I was walking into the hardest build I had ever had.
Oh nee, okay. Der erste Teaser war vor 3 Jahren sogar schon, okay. Alles klar. Sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild E3 2021 Teaser Nintendo Direct. Okay, okay, okay. Fantastisch.
Had to work on.
The big problem with the domain is its symmetry. The left side is identical to the right side. How is that a problem, I hear you asking? Theoretically, I just have to make one half and then copy it over since it's symmetrical. Well, there's one big problem. The domain isn't on a 90-degree angle.
Ach, scheiße, das ist das Problem. Muss es... Oh,
it's more like a 22-degree angle, meaning our line of symmetry isn't straight, it's diagonal, and because of this, we can't simply mirror the same design across the line. This meant that we would have to build each side of the domain separately with different shapes while still making it completely symmetrical. This became a massive problem as we started on the outer water paths. Due to the wiggly path that they took, it felt...
Es ist smart, aber auch so eine Linie hier durchzumachen, wie der 22... Was? 22 Grad Winkel? Ja, ich meine, ich war jetzt gerade ein bisschen... Habe nicht so viel aufgepasst. Ich habe gerade recherchiert hier nebenbei, okay. Verzeiht es mir, bitte, bitte. Auf jeden Fall sehr smart, dass er so eine Linie hier macht, damit an der kann man sich halt immer richtig geil orientieren dann. Aber sieht sehr anstrengend aus.
Impossible to make them look symmetrical due to the tricky angle. After a ton of time, we finally got them to look decently symmetrical. We moved on to the central plaza next, building up the round staircase with relative ease. Ombrins made sure to finish up the Mifa statue and worked in the shops nearby at relative ease. Ombrins made sure to finish up the Mifa statue. Statue and...
Also, okay, ich sehe grundprinzipiell, ich sehe es.
Worked in the shops nearby, as I moved upwards to complete the next section of the domain. Things got really difficult again, as replicating the designs while trying to work on the strange angle was super tough and demoralizing. Although it may not look like it, we had spent days...
Willst dich verwirren lassen, Mifa ist zwar rot, aber die Statue ist ja trotzdem blau.
On the domain at this point, and I was super demoralized after struggling with the angle for so long. I couldn't come up with any design that I liked anymore, so I ended up taking a break for a week, before I came back with...
Ihr dürft nicht vergessen, hat das Ganze gemacht mit Farbenblindheit. Das heißt, er wusste nicht, sind diese Blöcke, sind die wirklich passend? Oh,
a new idea. Instead of continuing to struggle on the weird angle, I would build on the regular 90-degree angle and then use world edit commands to rotate my designs to fit the correct angle. Things went a lot smoother once I started using this method, and I felt like I had revived my building skills in a way. The designs were still tough to replicate, and
Das geht einfach, man kann einfach mit World Edit sagen, okay, dreh es keine Ahnung, 80 Grad. Das macht es dann. Entspannt und es sieht dann immer noch gut aus, okay.
I had to restart once or twice to fix the scale, but it was much more bearable now. I thought the giant fish above the throne room would be super tough, but it actually came together pretty naturally and it was a ton of fun. Figuring out the colors did take some time though. After a few weeks of work, the domain was mostly complete at this point, but we were still missing the outer ring surrounding the main build. I was able to knock this ring out in a single sitting because it was entirely symmetrical, meaning I only had to build 1/8 of it before copy-pasting it across. Because this design was circular, I didn't have to worry about any weird angles affecting the build. But with that, Zora's Domain was complete, making for one of the prettiest builds I've ever worked on.
I had expected the domain to only take a few days to complete, finishing it around the end of September, but instead it took up literally all of October.
There was still some more stuff to do in the area, and lots of terraforming as well, but that only took a few more days. And by now, I was ready to build our first divine beast of the project. I
was looking forward to this.
Ooh.
Because I was foolish and inexperienced, I didn't really think to build a skeletal outline to make sure I had the right scale, and instead just started designing from the feet up. Luckily, it turned out mostly okay, and I would only have to make minor adjustments to the scale. Most of the structure for the beast came together easily until we got to the head. For some reason, I was trying to freehand the shape of the head until I realized that I could just start with a massive sphere and morph it into what I needed. I would have to redo the head though because it turned out too small, but with the ears and eye in place, most of the body was finished. The trunk wasn't that difficult now that I knew how to use more world edit commands, and the interior only took a few hours. Because yes, we did do the interiors for the divine beasts as well.
Und da wird jetzt das Problem mit dem Scaling auftreten, ha?
From the massive terraforming tasks to the difficulties with my colorblindness, and of course, the hell that was Zora's Domain, this was easily the toughest stretch of building I had ever done. But Lanayru was finished, and I was relieved thinking that this was the hardest part of the entire map, and that it would all be easier from here.
You might also be wondering how I was able to work on the map so much when I was still dealing with college. But to tell you the truth, I stopped going after my first week. You might be thinking, hey, that's pretty stupid. And you know what? I agree with you. That was extremely stupid. But even without
ein Risk-Taker. Hat sich ausgezahlt.
YouTube, I don't think I would have made it through college. School was never really my strong suit, and I didn't really know what I was studying in college for anyways. I didn't have anything that was interesting me. What I did know is that I had always wanted to be a YouTuber, and now I finally had that chance. I could always go back to college, but the chances of another shot at YouTube were very slim, so I decided to focus on this while I can, and if it doesn't work out, I'll just go back.
Which means that from now on, I'm officially all in on YouTube. I financially depend on this stupid project. There's no more turning back. I had finally ascended the mountain and reached my goal that I set at the start of the project. And looking ahead, there didn't seem to be anything on the map that would be...
Eine geile Geschichte, wie diese Map, diesen Typen, dann doch ein bisschen das Leben verbessert hat.
Harder than Zora's Domain.
I thought that I had certainly finished the hardest part of the map, but little did I know, Zora's Domain was far from the hardest challenge I would face on this project.
As I moved ahead into the next few regions of the map, the cruel reality of the project set in.
Oh no. Here we go, the calm before. Gehen wir rein.
With Lanayru finished, this is how much of the map we have completed so far. A good chunk, but still far from the end.
Genug.
And without much progress happening through December, we moved into 2023, marking an entire year since I first started building the map.
My original goal to finish this by the end of the year had obviously not been met, but I was pretty confident I could finish it this year instead.
Following the completion of Lanayru, I had two options. I could either continue moving north and loop around the top side of Hyrule, or I could head south and do Faerun, wrapping around the map in the opposite direction. I let my audience vote for what region they wanted to see next, and Faerun barely won the vote.
I didn't realize it at the time, but this changed the course of the project for the better, and saved me weeks, potentially months, of extra work.
Following the request of you guys, I headed out from the Great Plateau into Faerun, starting with the Bridge of Hylia. For some reason, I always enjoyed building bridges on the map, but this is the first one that I really did not like. I had a tough time outlining it, but the entrance gates to the
Es ist wieder so ein, seht ihr das?
Bridge did
Ja, schaut euch das an, es ist wieder so ein komisches Winkel, Scheiß. Oh Gott, ich hasse es.
My inexperience also made it difficult to properly space out the support columns for the bridge, which did add some extra time to the build. But after I finally figured it out and added some final details in place, the bridge was complete. As I worked on the area surrounding the lake tower, now is a good time to introduce the new builders I brought on once we started Faerun. Sly would help with various different ruins around the map, as well as parts of Hyrule Castle. Mono helped a lot with the Zonai ruins, Lurelin Village, and some ruins in Gerudo as well. Toby would help a ton throughout Faerun, Tabantha, and would also go on to help with parts of Hyrule Castle. Goat helped so much in pretty much every corner of the map that it would be faster to list the parts that she didn't contribute to. So, it's probably safe to assume that she was there for almost
almost every major build on the map. But anyways, as you've seen, we've completed most of the area around Lake Tower, so I moved into these woods where the Zonai ruins began. A lot of these ruins, such as the first tower, would appear all across the jungle of Faerun, so I once again would have a bunch of assets to copy paste around and save myself time later. But apart from a couple things, most of the ruins in this area were pretty simple. But moving into the jungle, things got a little more complex. Way back when I started this project, I only built the main 3 tree types, so I needed to figure out a design for these trees. The jungle trees ended up being my favorite from across the entire project. Something about them just looks so good to me. I can't believe I did this good of a job on them. But before I added all the trees in place, I wanted to finish the
Dschungelbäume sehen auch echt sehr cool aus.
Zonai ruins first, so that the trees wouldn't be in the way of the building. The first enemy camp is one that shows up in a few different spots on the map, but most of the ruins below were unique. I had to build up the Zonai dragon heads and some various other designs and enemy camps as I followed the river north. We also had to do quite a bit of ruinification to all the builds in this area. At the end of the river was the Spring of Courage, guarded by a massive dragon statue. This dragon skull was a ton of fun, and the first time that I ever had to actually make a statue of this scale before. And to my surprise, I was able to finish up the claws on either side of the head pretty fast as well. After finishing up the spring itself, I backtracked to add the thick jungle canopy, turning this into one of my favorite looking spots on the map. The Faerun region had always been a part of Breath of the Wild that I never paid much attention to, but as I continued working towards Lurelin Village,
Also ich habe die Region immer sehr gefeiert, weil die so special und besonders so tropisch und geil einfach war. Man hat sich einfach wohlgefühlt darin.
Quickly became my favorite region in the game. I gained a new sense of appreciation for the jungle region, and as a result, it also became the most fun part of this build project for me, and would remain my favorite all the way until today. Finishing the main bridge near Floria Falls and implementing the jungle trees is one of the most memorable parts of this project for me, and I'm not even entirely sure why. I just really like Faerun.
However, this would be the last time in which this project positively affected my outlook on Breath of the Wild.
Ooh.
I thought I had passed the most difficult part of the project with Zora's Domain, but what was waiting for me on the horizon was a far bigger threat to the completion of the map than the domain ever was.
The signs of the impending nightmare had not yet begun to show themselves, so I was able to peacefully enjoy the Faerun region,
oblivious to what was waiting for me above. For now, it was time to build our second dragon, Farash. This time, I put on my big boy pants and decided to try and build a dragon on my own. We got a general body shape down and added all of the spikes to the back of the dragon before adding a vibrant green color to it all. Hyrath reworked an old dragon head design of his to work for Farash, while I finished up the legs, which did give me a bit of trouble. But once that was wrapped up, Farash was complete. The rest of Faerun was pretty barren, with only the 3 brothers and some mild terraforming, but we did have to design some palm trees to add around the shores of Hyrule. They were tough at first, but it didn't take too long before we got the formula down and were able to make some solid designs. The Ocean's Edge did have some enemy camps and other minor builds, but nothing that took too long, and we moved straight into Lurelin Village. As it turns out, pretty much every single building in the village is the same design. So, after just this one building, most of the village was just complete. There were
Nintendo ein bisschen an Ressourcen gespart.
still a couple other unique...
Oder hat die Entwicklungszeit gefehlt? Es ist ein viel zu großes Spiel, um es in 4, 5 Jahren zu entwickeln. Es ist zu groß. Selbes Problem mit Tears of the Kingdom. Es ist zu viel, um es in 5 Jahren fertigzustellen.
Unique building designs, which were kind of shaped like boats. These two were much more fun to build up. These were a bit trickier than the other design, but not by much. Once we finished up the interiors, we added all of the smaller details around town, making it one of the fastest settlements that we've completed on this project. Next up, we had made it to Eventide Island. However, there wasn't much to actually build on the island apart from some copy-pasted enemy camps, some copy-pasted ruins, but basically just a bunch of reused assets. But with the completion of Eventide, we have finished another region of the map after just a couple months.
Yeah, while it does feel like we're progressing pretty fast in this video, you have to realize that there are hours and hours of work being condensed into just a few seconds. This video doesn't come close to showing the full scale of the project, and does not show everything.
So if you're interested in a more in-depth explanation of the building process, you can check out the full Breath of the Wild series below. There are 8 episodes, each focusing on a different region. By now, in March 2023, we were just a few months away from the release of Tears of the Kingdom, the official sequel to Breath of the Wild.
And the question that's probably on a lot of your guys' mind is whether or not I'll be doing Tears of the Kingdom. But before we can properly discuss that, we need some extra context from the rest of the project. So, we'll talk about that later.
Ich würde sehr gerne wissen,
But
ob er das auch
before
noch
Tears of the
macht.
Kingdom released in May, I wanted to finish up the entire Gerudo region, for which it looked like I had plenty of time for. But then I decided to spend an entire month working on another video to rebuild Skyloft, and suddenly we only had a month left to accomplish my goal. But unfortunately, as I began on Gerudo, the true antagonist of the project began to unveil itself to me. Starting from the Great Plateau and moving into Gerudo, the first stop along the way was the Colosseum. The design was pretty simple considering it was just a massive circle, but the interior was tough to squeeze everything in. Outlining the different floors and especially the staircases was pretty difficult, but soon enough it was finished, and the rest of the island around the Colosseum was pretty empty with only some small ruins and pools of malice. After finishing up the nearby stable and the smaller details around it, we moved on to Dig Dog's suspension bridge, where I once again faced more terraforming troubles, as the islands were pretty much all missing. The good old sand trick helped me a little bit, but I had to do a lot of manual smoothing as well. Once the islands were finished, though, we added the bridges between them, which were simple designs composed of dark oak wood. Going into the Gerudo Highlands, I needed a good block palette to match the sandy colors of Gerudo, but partially due to my colorblindness, I really struggled to find anything that matched the right color.
Es ist wieder die Colorblindness. Ach du Scheiße.
And I ended up settling on this super gross orange palette.
Ja,
I didn't
das
like
ist
it,
zu
and
orange.
nobody else did either,
Ja,
so
ja,
I swore
ja.
to come back one day
Nee, okay, das ist es wirklich
to
nicht.
change it. A dreadful task that we encountered here in the valley was the scaffolding. These cliffs are
Also dieses Orange matcht dieses helle, grelle, beige, gelb nicht im
covered with
Ansatz.
scaffolding that we had
Hat
to
er recht,
build.
das
And
muss er dringend
something
überarbeiten.
about this task was just so painful. It was tedious, it was boring, and there was so much of the scaffolding that it just felt like it would never end. As I began to work on the scaffolding, I began to get this feeling that I just didn't want to work on the map anymore.
Ja, das Orange
Throughout the years that
triggert
I've been
mich.
working on this
Oh,
project,
fuck.
I maintained quite a bit of motivation, but for the first time since the initial restart, I felt my motivation waning. Now, I found
das ist
myself
schlecht.
having to force myself to get online occasionally so that I could get something done, which I had never had to do before. Looking back, these were clear signs of an impending burnout, but not knowing it at the time, I continued to push through.
Impending Doom approaches, wie man im Fachjargon sagt.
Which would only make it a lot worse in the end.
With the scaffolding and Sheikah Tower put in place, I wanted to move south and finish up the labyrinth and southern Gerudo Highlands. In this area was the first labyrinth that I've built on the map, so I didn't really know how to tackle it. I decided to get a rough outline for the maze before designing the walls, giving it a sandy brown color to match the desert area. After building up the outer walls, since the corners of the maze are all symmetrical, I copied the sign that we had completed to all of the others, before going through the maze on foot and making it entirely accurate to Breath of the Wild. This probably took longer than you think it did. Moving further along, there was a large quarry to the entrance of
Also das Labyrinth 1:1 akkurat zu machen, ist auch schon sehr anstrengend. Vor allem, da muss man auch immer, man muss ja in Breath of the Wild den Überblick im Labyrinth behalten, wo man gerade ist, um in Minecraft an derselben Stelle genau das so zu bauen, wie es im Labyrinth ist. Puh. Obwohl man auch einfach auf der Map schauen kann, wo man gerade ist und dann, ja okay, gut, vielleicht ist es doch nicht so hart, wie ich es mir gerade vorstelle.
the desert, which housed one of the many stables found across the map. The blocky gray stones did look weird at first, but in the end, I think they turned out quite cool. There was a massive rock pillar that we had to terraform as well, and some bridges up at the top of it. Our first stop in the desert itself is Kara Kara Bazaar, for which I built the large rock structure first. It was tricky to get the shape right because the thin middle section made it look like it didn't properly support the top side, but that's how it is in Breath of the Wild as well, so I stuck with it. The rest of the bazaar was simple and empty though, but we did have to reuse our palm tree designs here. The eastern desert also contains the 7 heroine statues, something that I expected to be super difficult, but in reality they weren't too bad. For a lot of these desert ruins, I used red sandstone instead of the
Wenn das alles noch nicht so schwer war in der Gerudo-Region, was genau wird es dann?
regular kind because
Warum ist das hier der Erzfeind? Warum ist die Gerudo-Region der Arch-Nemesis von ihm? Warum? Ich bin sehr gespannt.
I didn't want it.
Ich habe das Video natürlich gesehen, aber ich weiß es nicht mehr. Ich weiß nicht mehr, was genau das Problem war.
to blend in with the sand, but later down the line, I changed my mind and I would end up coming back through to change a lot of it back to regular sandstone, including these 7 statues here. Apart from some other small bits of ruins and bone structures that appear all over the desert, there wasn't much else significant in the area, apart from the Gerudo Great Skeleton. I had already designed some bones earlier in the desert, so a lot of these were reused assets. The head was of course entirely unique though, but the smoothing work wasn't too bad and it turned out alright. We used a mix of white blocks like calcite to properly color these bones. Now, the entire desert was complete. All that remained was Gerudo Town.
While I had expected Gerudo to be a breath of fresh air compared to the rest of the project, it ended up being my least favorite part of the map so far.
Despite the incoming release of Tears of the Kingdom, the extra hype just didn't drive my motivation to keep building.
Instead, I felt pressured to finish Gerudo on time, forcing myself to work on the map when I didn't want to, which began to sour my attitude towards the map. Despite that, I kept going and was determined to finish Gerudo before Tears.
Gerudo Town was at a 45-degree angle on the map, which
Aber hat das richtige Mindset und macht weiter, egal wie wenig Bock hat.
May sound bad when you remember the 22-degree angle of Zora's domain, but 45 degrees is actually perfectly fine since the line of symmetry at this angle does allow for designs to be mirrored perfectly across. And also, Gerudo Town isn't perfectly symmetrical anyways. The town was easy enough to outline because the height map actually generated some good markings for where the town should go. And apart from the interiors, there wasn't much design work that needed to be done here. A lot of the walls were just plain sandstone without much texture. The main plaza did have a lot of market stalls that I had to design, but they weren't that big and some of them were duplicates. After the northern side of the town was complete, and once all the interiors were finished, I moved on to the main palace. After outlining the main structure that was a little more complicated than the rest of town, I got to work on the side buildings. The armory was a bit of a tight squeeze, but luckily we made it work. On the other hand, the sand seal area was extremely simple. The throne room was a quick interior to build, with the stone statues being the only hard part, and Riju's bedroom above wasn't that tough either. Once the town was complete, I was able to move back outside and add the rocks above the town, which required a lot of manual smoothing. These type of rocks that were unique required a lot more work than just the generic mountains and rocks of Hyrule, but once we had added some color to the outer walls, the town was finished. Another settlement to mark off our map. The Gerudo Highlands still needed to be completed, but they were pretty much completely empty. There's like nothing up here apart from some copy-pasted enemy camps. The only noteworthy build in this area is the Yiga clan hideout. There was a lot of terraforming to do in the valley leading up to the hideout, but there wasn't anything to really build outside. I mean, it is supposed to be secret, so it makes sense. I don't usually do interior work because I'm bad at it, but I took the initiative here. The first room was the most difficult with miniature versions of the 7 heroines, but the other rooms inside turned out quite good and weren't too hard to build. This was certainly a unique build compared to everything else we did in Gerudo. The Master Koga arena doesn't really have anything going on either, apart from some hanging streams and a little design around the chasm. And finally, the only build left in Gerudo was the second divine beast of the project.
Jetzt bin ich gespannt.
I was still too stupid to make a proper skeletal outline for Vana Boris, making the legs extremely tricky to design as we moved upwards. But once we got up to the main body, maintaining the scale of the divine beast was pretty trivial. I followed the same method as I did with Varuta, fixing up the base of the legs and then working my way up the side to complete the main torso. The design of Naboris' back was a lot easier than Ruta's, but once the tail was finished, things got a little harder. The neck was super tricky to get looking right. I thought this first design was good, so I moved on to building the head, but once I saw the whole thing together, I realized it looked really bad. So I revamped the neck, making it thicker at the base, and it suddenly looked a lot better. The interior was a super tight squeeze, but we knocked it out in just a few hours.
Now is a good time to mention, we did build all of the Blight Ganons later on.
I built Water Blight on stream once, Goat built Thunder Blight Ganon, and Ombrains took care of Fire Blight and Wind Blight.
With Naboris complete, I had finished Gerudo just before Tears of the Kingdom, uploading episode 5 just a few days before its release. Considering my waning motivation, I figured that now was a good time to take a break from the project and focus on the new game.
Little did I know, things were about to get so much worse.
After playing Tears, I extended my break to build the Great Sky Islands from that game in a separate video.
By the time I finished up that video, it was late in July, over halfway through the year.
Surely I can still finish the map before the end of 2023, right?
Eieiei. Wir haben 2024, Ende.
I mean, how much more of the map do I really have to build?
Oh, weia.
Half the map is still missing. I might not actually be able to finish this by the end of the year, huh? Imagine you just spent a year and a half of your life going through this map, going through everything that you just saw, and by the time you're finally losing interest and just starting to get sick of the map, you find out that you're only halfway there.
I tried to get back into the project in early August, but I just couldn't do it. I was so uninterested in the map that building for more than 15 minutes felt exhausting.
I had just encountered the biggest roadblock of the project, something that most people who work on creative projects have probably experienced before. The thing that we all fear the most, burnout. I had used all of my steam getting through Necluda, Laneru, Farron, and Gerudo.
And on top of that, my 3-month break from the project didn't even feel like a break, because the Great Sky Island just felt like another build for the project.
And so, I decided that the healthiest option to keep myself sane was to extend my break from the map and focus on some other things.
The slump.
Around this time, I met a
Chapter
fellow creative mode YouTuber named Shovel, who showed me some new building mods that I didn't know about. While a couple of these tools
Ooh.
were really nice, most of it just wasn't what I needed for this kind of project. But it wouldn't be long before the truly revolutionary mod for this project came along.
Jetzt bin ich gespannt.
I decided to test out these new mods on a new build separate from my main project while on break, and it was a total breath of fresh air. By the end of August, after spending almost an entire month away to learn these new tools, I knew that it was time to return to the project.
I was still dealing with intense burnout, but I had an idea to help me overcome it.
If I wasn't enjoying the building process on the map anymore, what if I started live streaming the project to give myself a new outlet to enjoy the project through? Going into Tabantha and Hebra, I decided to live stream every single hour that I spent building on the map, and it certainly helped me out. Satori Mountain was the first build that I tackled upon my return, which required some minor terraforming at the peak. As for the sandy rock color of Tabantha, I decided to use one of my new mods to apply a gradient to the mountain, which turned out pretty cool. This palette of stripped oak and sandstone would be used throughout all of Tabantha. The Sanodin Park ruins also sat nearby, the only tricky part of them being the horse statue in the middle. Once we had figured it out though, the Satori Mountain area was complete. Heading into the Ridgeland, I built up the large mushroom trees that scatter the area, making a few different shapes and sizes to fill out a proper mushroom forest. The nearby Thundra Plateau was just a bunch of reused assets from Farron, so there was almost no new building here. And with all the mushroom trees in place, there was really only one other build in this region, the Breach of Demise. I used one of the new mods that I learned to terraform the large spikes just a little bit faster than World that it would have allowed me to. The block palette was really tough to figure out, eventually settling on a lighter sandstone color with darker splotches of oak wood. Moving into Tabantha, the large bridge outside the stable was finished up by Ezio, and I decided that this bridge would be a good spot to build our third and final dragon of the map, Dinral, since this is pretty much the main spot that most people find it at. Shovel, the YouTuber that showed me all the mods a little bit ago, logged on to help out with the head of Dinral, which worked out well since I don't think I would have been able to make it look nearly as good as he was. Meanwhile, I worked on the main body, adding the spikes to the back and deciding on block palettes for the dragon. Shovel finished up the head with some final touches and streaks of fire coming out of the mouth, while I worked on the legs and claws with some other builders. With all the final details in place, I think this turned out to be the best dragon build out of all three we've done.
At this point, I had been streaming almost every day
Das schaut sehr geil aus.
for 2 weeks
Generell alle Drachen. Wirklich. Respekt.
straight. And while it had helped to ward off the burnout, my new problem was that I was getting burnt out from streaming. Consequently, the streams
Es wird langsam ein bisschen funny. Okay. Ja, ärgerlich. Double Burnout.
screeched to a halt, but I had gotten the ball rolling on the map again, and I was closing in on Rito Village.
Being able to build another main settlement was a good bit of motivation for me, and luckily for me, there was another big motivating factor that had just recently hit the scene: Axiom.
This was a revolutionary mod for building, with so many crazy features that I can't possibly list them all. But there was something that I immediately realized it was useful for:
Und das ist
terraforming.
For nearly 2 years at this point, I had been terraforming with painstaking methods, such as falling sand or just doing it all by hand. But with Axiom, just quickly draw some spheres to get a structure down. It doesn't look very natural? No problem. Just use a quick smooth brush to make it look better. Is it too smooth? No problem. Just use a roughen brush to make it look a bit rockier. Also, remember how I had been adding every single tree on the map one at a time? Well, with Axiom, I could literally paint an entire forest in seconds.
Axiom had completely trivialized some of the most tedious tasks on the map, which was going to be a huge help for me soon, considering there were entire mountains.
Also platzierte die Bäume doch nicht so akkurat. Oder sehe ich das falsch?
Missing in Hebra. This, along with the incoming Rito Village build, gave me enough steam to push a little further ahead.
Heading towards Tabantha Tower, I got to use my Guardian Skywatcher designs for the first time ever, before building the ancient ruins at the nearby shrine. There was another Great Fairy Fountain nearby, but I already designed these, so I just had to change the color. The area around the Sheikah Tower was pretty barren, with some copy-pasted pillars and pools of malice. This is when I first began to use Axiom more to give the flat, boring cliffs of the area a bit more shape to them, which really helped the area look a lot more complete. With only a little bit of cleanup work to be done north of the tower, I moved quickly on to Rito Village. I had been suffering through the western side of the map for weeks now, only getting little bits of enjoyment out of the project here and there. So I was hoping that building up a main settlement again would be a highlight and rejuvenate my spirits a little bit.
But unfortunately, due to some circumstances that I can't really talk about here, this build ended up getting completely soured for me.
The entire rock pillar of Rito Village was missing from the map, but since Axiom had luckily just hit the scene, it made what would have been an impossible task into something that I could knock out in under an hour. After outlining the village itself at the base of the rock, I realized that every single building in the town was identical, except for the inn. I designed the inn first, which was definitely the highlight of the build since I was first figuring out the block palette and design details of these buildings. The main building that appears multiple times throughout the village is pretty much just a smaller version of the inn. After putting the buildings into their proper locations, I did some light terraforming out back and added in the shrine. There was still all of the interiors to build, which were all slightly different, but after I completed that, I just had to add some final details before I was able to call the village complete. Once I finished adding the bridges that connected the islands together, another main settlement was crossed off of the map. If I was completely drained of fuel before, I was now in severe fuel debt.
Not only had this build failed to refresh my spirits, but I was headed into Hebra next.
An empty, desolate land with nothing interesting to build, but completely jam-packed with a ton of annoying terraforming work. Not something that I was hoping to see when I desperately needed motivation.
I had always thought that Zora's Domain would be the hardest part of the project, but looking back, that was a fun type of build. It was challenging in a fun way. It pushed my skills and made me develop better building techniques. But Tabantha and Hebra weren't doing any of that. It was just boring, tedious, mentally exhausting.
That is what made this the hardest region of the map by far. It wasn't.
Die schwersten Regionen sind die mit nichts drinnen. Und davon gibt's leider im Breath of the Wild ein paar. Bei 5 Jahre Entwicklungszeit leider nicht ganz reichen. Es war für ein Game of the Year und eines der besten Spiele aller Zeiten. Aber trotzdem nicht genug Zeit, um diese Position auch für immer zu festigen.
It wasn't physically difficult, it was mentally difficult. Back when the project started, most people seemed to think that this project would never be completed, and maybe they were right. Maybe this is where I would finally throw in the towel, faced with overwhelming exhaustion from the project.
My outlook on the map had completely soured, and I wanted nothing more than to be done with this project.
Maybe this was the end. Nah, I'm just kidding.
You didn't really think I would give up on this project, did you?
Also wirklich, wenn man schon an dem Punkt ist, wenn man an dem Punkt schon gelangt ist, jetzt aufzuhören, dann wäre es eher giga-lost.
No, because I knew that if I could just get through Hebra, things would get a lot better.
Building up Eldin and being that close to the end of the project would certainly boost my motivation.
A lot of people ask me how I maintain motivation over such a massive project like this, but the truth is, it's not always about motivation. Your motivation is always going to slip on a project like this. The real key is discipline. It's about forcing yourself to work even when you don't want to. It's about knowing that the temporary pain of burnout is far better than the infinite pain of regret over not finishing this.
Months had gone by since I finished Gerudo, and I was sick of how long this was taking. It was time for a massive, painful assault through Hebra, so that I could finally find better days. The first task in Hebra was the Rito training grounds, which had nothing but copy-pasted designs from Rito Village and a little bit of terraforming. Western Hebra in general was pretty empty, but the terrain was a complete disaster, meaning that I had to do a lot of terraforming work to pretty it up. For the Hebra Great Skeleton, the entire northern mountain above it was just missing. I had to spend hours terraforming it all myself. The skeleton itself was pretty similar to the Gerudo one, with only minor differences in the head. After finishing the smaller details and last terraforming tasks in the area, I moved on to the peak of Hebra itself, which was completely missing, of course. But luckily, I was starting to get fully in the swing of Axiom, making this go by a lot quicker than it would have otherwise.
Also das sind jetzt die Hebra-Berge und das andere war Tabantha, ich weiß nicht, wie es im Deutschen heißt. Auf jeden Fall da habe ich das verwechselt. Das hier sind jetzt die Hebra-Berge. Ich glaube, dass ich das früher gemeint habe, dass das andere Gebiet die Hebra-Berge sind. Aber nee, stopp. Das ist die Hebra-Berge.
Parts of Hebra also had these large rock structures that were
nicht.
completely missing from the map, meaning that I had to spend quite a lot of time building them all up. After finishing up even more terraforming above this river, Central Hebra was finished, so I moved east towards the stable, which only had some minor work to be done in the area. I did have the second Zonai Labyrinth nearby, which ended up being really fun just like the other two. I don't know, something about outlining the mazes was just a ton of fun. Nearby, we also had Tanagar Canyon, which had an absolute ton of terraforming work to be done across the entire length of the gorge.
Und das alles, ihr erinnert euch, was wir am Anfang gelernt haben, weil dieses Höhenmap-Dingsbums nicht erkennt, ob da, wenn das jetzt so hoch ist, aber da ist eine kleine Lücke darunter, erkennt es das nicht. Und deshalb muss er das alles einzeln machen. Und das ist krass.
So, it was another day to thank the heavens for Axiom. The Forgotten Temple.
Und das hat er am Anfang gar nicht. Aber da musste er gar nicht, noch nicht so viel wie hier machen. Also hat er ein bisschen Glück gehabt, ne?
At the end of the gorge was a slow build with a very limiting block palette, as we pretty much only had
ein bisschen Glück und ein bisschen Pech, weil stell dir vor, das hätte er am Anfang an dieses Tool gehabt. Das wäre crazy.
The sandstone blocks to work with. The interior was tough to work on as any build in a confined space is, but after a couple days of building, the entire structure was complete. I even had to build the goddess statue in the back of the temple. It only took a few weeks of building, but I had finally pushed through and completed all of Hebra. And I had been smart enough to leave one last exciting build for the end of the region. Divine Beast Von
okay.
I messed up the scale for the beast on my first attempt, but as I finished up the base of the tail, I finally smartened up and added a skeletal outline for the wings to get
Jetzt macht er sie tatsächlich. Er startet. Es ist die erste Outline, die er bei einem Divine Beast macht. Sehr fraglich, warum erst jetzt. Weil die anderen so zu freestylen, gefährlich.
Right scale down before moving on to do
Aber ist sicher ausgegangen.
Design work. The shape of the wing was pretty straightforward, but fixing up the underside and the tops of the wings was a little annoying. Luckily, this Divine Beast is completely symmetrical, just like all of the others. Again, instead of jumping straight into design work, I actually outlined the head beforehand, so I was able to completely nail the shape, and it ended up being super accurate. I did the legs and talons next, which were tricky to find the correct shape for before completing the underside of the bird, finishing the exterior. As for the interior, this was the most spacious one I had to work with so far, so it went a lot smoother than the other Divine Beasts. And finally, with it out of the way, Hebra was complete. It was now late November, 6 entire months since I had last posted an episode in the series.
November von welchem Jahr? 2023?
This was by far the toughest video that I had ever had to make.
But it was finally over. The actual hardest part of the Breath of the Wild map was behind me at long last.
I had officially failed to meet my end-of-year deadline, but I wasn't too bothered, because my theory held true.
Aber die Deadline muss man ja nicht wirklich genau einhalten. Solange man so ein Monsterprojekt zu Ende führt.
In February of 2024, after finishing up another project, I was ready to return.
Was? I built the rumbling in Minecraft Attack on Titan? Okay. Auch also Attack on Titan. Shokusel Anime. Wirklich top Tier. Auch geiles Finale gewesen. Da baut er den einfach mal nach, aber war der nicht extrem riesig? Warte mal, der hat ja da auch alle Titanen nachgebaut, die aus der Mauer kamen. Achtung, Spoiler, okay, warte mal, das kam jetzt nachdem ich gespoilert habe. Spoilerwarnung. Ja, scheiß drauf, ganz ehrlich.
Turn to the map. And with my return to the project,
jeder, der jetzt noch kein Attack on Titan geschaut hat, ist eigentlich nicht selber schuld, weil sind die letzten 2 Folgen eigentlich schon in Deutsch übersetzt worden? Das weiß ich gar nicht. Ich hab sie nur in deutschen Untertitel geschaut. Auf jeden Fall schaut euch Attack on Titan an.
there also came the return of my motivation and drive to finally finish this thing.
Chapter 5, Renaissance. Ja, jetzt ist er ist schon so close, die Sterne zu greifen. Aber doch sind sie noch ein bisschen entfernt. Aber er hat jetzt schon circa 2/3 der Map. Es ist... Oder machen wir es besser, weil wir haben es, glaube ich, besser in so 4 Abteile abzugrenzen. 3/4. Ja, 2/3. Nee. Ich glaube, er hat ein bisschen mehr als 2/3. Also würde ich schon sagen 3/4. 3/4 der Map hat er jetzt schon. Jetzt kann er nicht mehr aufhören.
The 2-year anniversary of the project came and went as I worked on my Attack on Titan video.
But once that was finished up, I returned to the map, and for the first time in months, I was actually excited to build again.
My plan was to knock out the Akala region next, before heading up into Eldin, where I would complete the last major settlement of the map, as well as the 4th and final Divine Beast. Over a year ago, the will of you guys had nearly sent me here first instead of Farron, but I'm glad that didn't happen, because the largest terraforming tasks of the entire project were awaiting me in Eldin. But since we went the other way around the map, Axiom released in time for me to use for Death Mountain.
If we had come to Death Mountain first, I wouldn't have had Axiom for this monumental terraforming task. But before we can get to that, we need to finish up Akala.
Following the path from Lanayru, I reached Akala Citadel, the home
Ohne dieses Tool wäre damals ein bisschen cooked gewesen, das stimmt.
Of yet another Sheikah Tower. After finishing the bridge across the valley, I gave the cliffs their proper orangish brown color before starting on the structure of the castle. A lot of the structures here were very similar to those from the Great Plateau walls, so it felt very familiar to be building up the citadel. Most of the structures are also just copy-paste, so I was able to complete the structure extremely fast, since it's pretty much just the same thing over and over again. Up top, there were some ruins that were unique to this area, which were pretty time-consuming to build up, but once they were done, the citadel was complete. Moving through Akala to the east, we would soon come up on Terrytown, with only a few small builds between us. I finished the Tingle Islands, which were mostly comprised of reused assets, as well as some nearby bridges and the last fairy fountain of the map. Terrytown itself is super small, but the various angles of the buildings made it quite tricky to work with, and the squarish shapes of the building actually made it more difficult to squeeze in all of the structures. To make up for it, the designs weren't too complicated, as they were pretty much just a bunch of colored squares. Once the interiors were finished up, I added in the smaller details around town, but there really wasn't much more to do, and the town was finished very fast. The rest of Akala was pretty empty, so it wouldn't take me too long to make my way up to the tech lab. The strangest part about working on Akala was that it made me feel almost sad. After the monumental task of Hebra and Tabantha, it finally felt like I was actually close to finishing the project. While I was excited to finally complete the map, I had been working on this project for over 2 years at this point. This was the map that kickstarted my YouTube channel, and by now, I had amassed over 200,000 subscribers. And the idea that all of it would suddenly come to an end
wasn't exactly a happy thought, but regardless, there was still a lot of excitement around the idea of finishing this map.
The tech lab.
Aber selbst wenn es jetzt zu Ende ist, da ist noch ein Tears of the Kingdom mit einem ganzen Untergrund und einer Welt über den Wolken, die man dann natürlich noch umsetzen kann. Was er wahrscheinlich wird, oder?
ended up being a lot more
Er
complicated
meinte, die Frage wird er noch beantworten.
than I thought it was, as there were a lot of different structures that make up the lab as a whole. But once I finished up the structures around the back and the telescope, the design was complete apart from some final texture variation. Nearby, we also had the final Zonai labyrinth of the map, which was a real shame since I really enjoyed building these mazes. This was definitely my favorite of the labyrinths to build, regardless of how long it took me to scour the floor of the maze to add every little secret. Akala was now finished, meaning it was time to start work on the next region that I once thought would be the hardest part of the map.
Of course, due to a certain other region, I no longer believe this to be true. Around this time, I did add a couple new builders to the map as well.
Voxel, who would help with Eldin, Akala, and the Woodland region, as well as parts of Central Hyrule. Scale also helped with parts of Akala and Eldin too. Horaltum was a special builder to be added to the map, as his primary goal was to build all 120 shrine interiors to properly implement on the map, which he would manage to finish before the end of the project. Heading into
Das ist auch crazy. Jemand anderes hat währenddessen an allen 120 Schrein-Designs gearbeitet. Und die wurden dann hier auch noch eingebaut. Das ist krass.
Death Mountain, the primary issue with this region were the dozens of overhanging rocks scattered across the volcano. Because remember, the height map did not generate a single overhanging rock, so literally every single one of these were missing from the map.
Back in the day, Eldin seemed like it would be an impossible task. But now, with the help of Axiom, it was honestly a walk in the park.
Okay.
Kind of like what I'm doing right now.
As I swept across Eldin, adding every single rock I could find that was missing from the map, I realized that it was actually quite enjoyable.
Er hätte es cooler gefunden, wenn er es hier ein bisschen subtiler im Video macht, wenn er sagt, das ist ein Walk in the Park und währenddessen walkt er in den Park, ohne es wirklich zu sagen. Na, ein bisschen subtileres Storytelling hier. Na, man muss hier seine Zuschauer nicht für dumm halten. Die können diese Parallelen sicherlich auch selber sehen. Oder?
Enjoyable. I was able to simply turn on a video in the background and mindlessly terraform for hours at a time. It still took a while, but after a few days I had finished most of the terraforming throughout Eldin, but the actual volcano itself was still a complete mess. I had to spend lots of time working on this because I just couldn't figure out what was wrong with the mountain. It looked very weird to me, but I finally realized that the bottom didn't have enough shape to it and was able to fix it up. Now that I had finally completed the terraforming of Death Mountain, I returned to the entrance of Eldin and began to build my way up the path towards Goron City. Most of the builds here in Eldin were very small and not very significant. There were some metal structures all
Da, schau dir diese geilen Lavafälle an. Ui, ui, ui. Kann ich das Ganze nochmal im Ganzen anschauen? Das sah sehr cool
across
aus.
the mountain that I had to build, and also some new enemy camps unique to the volcano, but that was pretty much it. The Goron mines were the most significant build along the path, and even that was pretty small. Paired with a reused asset of an enemy camp, I was able to move swiftly on to Goron City. The valley that the city resides in was super small, so much so that I would have to make slight adjustments to the terrain to properly fit everything
Ja, voll cool. Ist voll toll.
in.
Lavafälle
But
auf
we
die
finished
Eis.
outlining the buildings soon enough, and it all seemed like it would fit well. All the buildings in town were just massive rocks, so it wasn't really that difficult to build the majority of them. The only time-consuming part of this build was adding all of the small details around the city and doing the interiors. I also had to build the large bridge above town, but for that, I would need to build the massive Goron statues overlooking the city. These statues were incredibly tough to get looking right. Organic builds like this are not my strong suit, especially when they're very bland without much detail. The first two were by far the most difficult, but the Daruk statue was a bit easier because it had more features to add, such as hair and wristbands, that broke up the solid rock color and made it look a lot better. There isn't too much left to do in northern Eldin apart from the Goron mines, which was pretty much just a collection of some rocks and cannons. I did have to build the crab rock nearby though, and the railway going through the lava lake took some time to outline. Further down the mountain was the final great skeleton of the project, which, again, reused a lot of assets from the other two. The only new part of the bones being the skull. Gutcheck Rock was also nearby, but that area took no longer than a few hours to complete. So with most of the mountain complete, I began working my way up the path to Varudania. There was some light terraforming here that I had missed earlier, and more minecart tracks, but they weren't too hard to add in place. As for Death Mountain itself, while I had done most of the general terraforming earlier, it still needed a more precise touch for the final details, so I had to take some time to do more terraforming here and add in all of the cannons.
But there was still a big problem with Varudania itself.
You see, for every divine beast that I built, I placed them in their location from before Link conquers them in-game. But to follow that trend with Rudania, I would have to build the divine beast walking diagonally across the volcano. That angle would be super tough, but I learned my lesson from Zora's Domain. Instead of building the beast at this angle, I decided to build it on the regular axis first and rotate it onto the mountain later. This was the first divine beast where I was finally smart enough to start with a skeletal outline.
Ich hab's jetzt nicht ganz gecheckt. Ich hab's erst gedacht, in Zora's Domain hat er das gelernt, aber es stimmt ja gar nicht. In Zora's Domain hat er gelernt, zuerst gerade bauen und dann mit World Edit kann das auch einfach dann schräg machen. Warum auch immer sowas möglich ist. Ich verstehe es nicht, aber okay, es ist möglich so.
Line of the entire thing, which made the building process so much easier. I don't know why it took me so long to start doing this, but after testing the rotation technique onto the mountain, it was clear that this method of mine would work. Varudania is super symmetrical, so after building just a small portion of the main body, I was able to copy-paste it across and finish the whole thing. The tail was a bit trickier to design because of its strange angles, but it was nowhere near as hard as the other divine beasts. At this point, all that was missing was the head, which was just a simple cone-like shape, so it was pretty easy to finish up. After rotating it to fit the mountain and cleaning up the design a bit, I began to work on the legs, which were definitely the hardest part of the divine beast. It took a few different tries with new methods and ideas before I was able to find something that would work. And after adding some fire to the feet, just like they are in Breath of the Wild, the final divine beast of the project was complete. The mountain still felt a bit empty though, so I...
der Mountain, ich finde den Mountain schon cool eigentlich. Mit diesem, das sieht schon doch sehr cool aus.
I decided to add one last thing to the Elden region. I wanted to build the massive plume of smoke coming out of the volcano. My first attempt resulted in an absolutely massive plume of smoke, but it was just way too big, way too solid, and just didn't look like smoke. Months later, I came back to try again, but all I really succeeded in this time was making the smoke a little smaller. So, third time's a charm. I made the smoke funnel out a lot more with this final design, which made it look more natural, and I was able to achieve a much more smoky look with this one instead of making the entire thing solid. And so, after 3 months of work on the map, Akkala and Eldin had officially fallen, leaving just the center regions of the map to be completed. It was late in May at this point, but I was definitely on track to finish before the end of 2024.
I did plan on doing a Mario Kart and Minecraft video next, but there's no way that video was gonna take like 5 months or anything.
Oh yeah.
So the project took 5 months. Okay, now it's October 2024, and I wanted to finish building the map and release 2 videos about it before Christmas. That is a behemoth task.
But being so close to the end, I was more motivated than I ever had been.
My schedule was cleared, and I put everything else aside to solely focus on finishing this project.
Let's go. Chapter 6, the countdown.
In order to finish the project and release the videos before Christmas, I knew that I would have to finish building the map before November. I came back to the map on October 14th, which gave me roughly 17 days to finish Central Hyrule and the Woodland region. There was still also a lot of cleanup work to be done on the map, but I had a bit of spare time during my Mario Kart project, so I was able to finish a lot of these tasks early. For example, I finally redid the dueling peaks with Axiom, making them look a lot more accurate to Breath of the Wild. I also fixed up the very ugly Gerudo cliff colors.
For the remainder of the project, I decided to livestream every single day until the map was finished, sometimes even multiple times a day.
As the final push began, I first laid my eyes on the Woodland region, wanting to knock out the Lost Woods and Typhlo ruins as soon as possible. The Woodland Tower and military training camp were pretty quick builds, with mostly generic wood ruins in the area. I did have to come up with a new block palette for the stone in the area though. Apart from that, the only build in this area was the Lost Woods. This was my first time ever building a massive large-scale tree like this before, so I was a bit worried. But after using a large cone to get the basic shape of the tree down, I started adding in all of the roots near the bottom. The branches were pretty much just a bunch of lines going out in different directions, so I was able to make quick work of them with Axiom. Getting the face to look right was extremely difficult, and it took us a couple of attempts to get something that looked good, but we got there after a lot of tinkering. I colored the tree with various dark brown colors and a little bit of green before adding
da muss man auch denken, die Kirschblüten für den Baum.
in the pink leaves at the top.
die gibt es ja, hätte er dieses Projekt schon ein paar Jahre früher gemacht, würde es die gar nicht geben. Weil Mojang hat sich erst gedacht, oh ja, wir bringen jetzt, ich weiß gar nicht mehr, war das Update letztes Jahr? Nee, das war, oder? Ich weiß es nicht mehr, auf jeden Fall sind die das wollte ich nicht, ups. Auf jeden Fall, die Kirschblüten sind erst im Laufe des Projekts dazugekommen.
With the decoratry finished, we added
das
in
muss man
all of
sich
the
mal im
smaller
Kopf
details to
setzen.
Korok Woods itself, including the Master Sword pedestal, which turned out amazing. As for the Lost Woods, I would have to use a massive coat of different glass blocks to make a fog effect, and we changed the leaves of all the trees into glass as well to give it an even foggier look. With that complete, we moved
Smart.
on to the Typhlo ruins a little further north, but they were just a bunch of reused assets from Farron. It took a good bit of time to outline everything properly, but once it was done, I used a massive dome of tinted glass.
Wie Tinted Glass? Hat er einfach überall das Tinted Glass platziert und das dann unsichtbar gemacht oder hat er ein Texture Pack, dass das alles sich connectet und deshalb sieht man es nicht?
And other dark blocks to create the darkness effect. And trust me, it really does get dark inside. It had taken only a few days to finish up the woodland region, and it was now October 18th as I moved into Central Hyrule.
13 days remained to build all of Central Hyrule and the castle itself.
But luckily for me, Central
Krasse
Hyrule
Deadline.
was an extremely empty land, and most of the ruins and other structures in this area are reused assets from other regions.
Because of this, I knew that I could rip through Central Hyrule with ease and make it to the castle with plenty of time to spare.
I started with the western side of Central Hyrule first, filling out a lot of the duplicate ruins and enemy camps. I quickly reached the final Sheikah Tower on the map, which felt surreal as I thought back to almost 3 years ago when I kicked off the entire project by building the original tower. There were some scattered ruins here and a bit more further north, but everything around was just reused assets. Now moving on to the southern side of Central Hyrule, I had to build up the Bottomless Swamp, which houses a massive ancient skull with large horns. This looked like an intimidating build, but after working on a project like this for so long, my skills had developed so much that I was able to make quick work of it. Apart from the little bits of ruins scattered around the area, Central Hyrule was already complete, and it had only taken me a few days. 10 days remained until the end of the project, and I swiftly moved on to Castletown after completing the Sacred Ground ruins.
It's
I cleaned up the
crazy.
terrain of the town before moving on to the town walls, which were time-consuming but not very difficult. There were only a few building designs scattered around the town, so after we finished up a few of them, I was able to copy-paste them all across the area. Once I had figured out a block palette for the grass, I added in all of the malice pools and guardians roaming the town to finish it off. The 2 islands flanking the castle still remained, so despite the long day of building I just had with a castle town, I decided to focus up and finish the islands too. Luckily though, they were pretty empty and didn't have much to build. As the clock ticked over to October 23rd, the final build of the entire project was set to begin. In January of 2022, I began my journey to build all of Breath of the Wild in Minecraft, hoping to complete this project before the year's end. Fast forward 2 years and 10 months, and I finally made it to Hyrule Castle. I began as an amateur, someone with very little building knowledge, someone who had no idea what type of tools to use for a project like this. But after all this time, the map had honed my skills and knowledge, and coming out of this project, one might consider me a professional builder.
Personally, I think I have a long way to go before I can earn that title, but this journey was certainly a massive step towards that goal. So, let's finally finish this adventure and complete the final build on the map.
Hyrule Castle, let's
Using
go.
Axiom's shape tool, I began at the gatehouse and started making my way up the hill. As I got up past the first gatehouse, it became apparent that there was lots of terraforming to be done as well, as there were missing bridges, overhangs, and much more. The sanctum had such a complicated design that it took me 3 hours to outline the entire thing. I was very tired after this 6-hour stream. Now it was time to actually design the structures that I had outlined. I gradually learned the style for the castle as I built up these first few structures, using a lot of the fairly new tough blocks to give a bit of color variation.
Was ich, glaube ich, sehr anstrengend finden würde während eines 6-Stunden-Baustreams, wirklich dauerhaft auch noch hin und wieder zu reden und dann sagen, okay, wir benutzen hier den und den Block, boah, sieht das geil aus. Chat. Sagt mal, sieht es gut aus. Bitte, ich bin hier schon seit 18 Stunden am Bauen. Also es muss schon sehr anstrengend sein. Ich meine, er hat ja gesagt, er hat jeden Tag einen Stream gemacht, als er dieses letzte Gebiet gemacht hat. Das bedeutet, er hat nichts off-Stream gebaut, so wie ich das verstanden habe. Glaube ich jetzt mal. Bedeutet, er muss ja die ganze Zeit, während er diese Scheiße hier baut, und die sieht enorm aufwendig aus, muss er ja auch noch gleichzeitig irgendwie in seinem Stuhl verschlafen sitzen und seinen Chat irgendwie unterhalten.
Moving along the island to the east, I wanted to finish up all of the copy-pasted
Also es ist
castle
eine
walls
Meisterleistung,
surrounding
was
the
hier,
island, and that was pretty much all that was
geklotzt
here on
wurde.
this side of the castle. The gatehouses were two of the main structures to build up on the castle, which were extremely fun to work on. Definitely one of the highlights of building the castle. One of the only remaining builds left was Zelda's study, which ended up being harder than I expected it to. I really did not like this first design that I had made, and I couldn't quite put my finger on exactly what it was. So, after the stream, I completely restarted on the tower. And I'm glad that I did, because despite having to take some creative liberties with the design, this one turned out much better. I then fixed up Zelda's room itself across the valley, which did take some tinkering with the terrain to fit properly, before connecting the two up with the bridge. With Zelda's room and study complete, the sanctum was the only part of the castle left that I had to design. I was in for another 3-hour building session with the sanctum, as the lower levels were extremely complex. So were the upper levels, but not as much. Moving up to the second layer, I had to design some more towers, which for some reason gave me so much trouble. I don't know why these towers were making me struggle so much at the time. But after identifying its flaws, I was finally able to find a design that I was happy with. At this point, only the center tower of the sanctum remained, which luckily went a bit easier than the previous towers. There were also a few smaller towers flanking the center one. Once the tower was complete, I put it into its proper location in the sanctum and duplicated the symmetrical design across all 4 corners. After implementing some final details to the castle, such as the dead guardians, and coloring all of the cliffs and grass correctly, the exterior of the castle was finished after I put in all of the malice pools. As October 29th slipped over into the 30th, I had 48 hours to complete Hyrule Castle. But because of Halloween celebrations that I had to attend, it was actually less than 24 hours. And I still had most of the interiors, the pillars around the castle, and Calamity Ganon to build. I started my livestream on that day with no intention of ending it until the project was complete. The hours began to tick by as I made my way through the castle, but by the time my dinner break arrived 4 hours into the stream, I had only made my way into the library, which turned out to be the hardest build of the interior by far. It was so large and complex that it took 3 hours to build on its own. Finishing up the rest of the interiors took up another 2 hours as we approached the 10-hour mark of the live stream. Once the docks were finished up, we officially placed the 120th and final Sheikah Shrine of the project. However, we still had the interior of the sanctum to complete. By now, the clocks ticked past midnight, and Halloween was officially upon us.
Deadline! Oh ja!
The dawn of the final day. The sanctum had a super complex interior, and it took multiple other builders along with me to figure it out and get it complete. Down below, Ombrains had already been building up Calamity Ganon, and once she was finished, I came down to complete the Astral Observatory boss arena, which came out looking very nice. But after 12 hours of streaming, I finally began on Calamity Ganon. I added the swirling malice around the castle first, before beginning on the body of Ganon itself, which I really was not happy with for the longest time. It just looked off to me, so later I would come back to fix it up a bit more, and it turned out a lot better. 14 hours into stream.
Ich fand's immer schade in Breath of the Wild, dass diese swirling Calamity von Ganon die ganze Zeit. Ich fand's immer sehr schade, dass die einfach nur ums Schloss herum swirlt, aber nichts macht. Die hat ja nichts gemacht. Das habe ich immer ein bisschen ärgerlich. Ich dachte immer, es gibt so einen Zwischen-Endboss, so, und dann kommt die hier herunter in so ein richtig geiler Fight. Aber nee, das ist irgendwie leider nie passiert. Das finde ich bis heute schade. Dass man mit so einem coolen Ding nie etwas gemacht hat. Außer natürlich, dass es dann natürlich im Finale Phase 2 dieses fette Schwein geworden ist, aber das ist ja nicht mehr diese Verehrung, die umherswirlt, das ist dann einfach nur Fleisch gewordener Hass, der ein scheiß Endboss war, der nicht so cool war. Danke an Tears of the Kingdom, dass du das bisschen sehr viel tausendfach besser gemacht hast mit diesem unglaublich epischen Endboss. Holy shit.
At around 5 a.m. on Halloween morning, 2024. Only one detail remained missing from the map.
All of the builders and my friends who were online at the time joined me in the sanctum of Hyrule Castle, where everybody had a chance to add a block to the Golden Triforce. As I prepared to place the final blocks of the map, I thought back to my time on the project. From the initial failure that led me to giving up YouTube, to the overwhelming support that brought me back. From the struggles of Zora's Domain and the delight of the Faron region, to the pain of Gerudo and mental torture of Hebra. After the hope with the Elden region and the determination through Central Hyrule, we had finally made it to the moment that I had been dreaming of for years. I officially announce that the Breath of the Wild in Minecraft project is 100% complete.
Let's go. 10.
After 1,009 days, 8 hours and 56 minutes,
Ooh,
with
yeah.
more than 2,000 hours spent building on the map, it was
Ach,
over.
du
And that does
Scheiße.
not include the hundreds, potentially thousands of hours I spent editing content for the YouTube channel.
For nearly 3 years, this project has sat at the forefront of my mind. It had taken 8 installments in this series, for which millions of people showed up to join me on this journey. But there is still one more thing that we must do. Something that I'm sure you guys have all been waiting for.
At the end of each episode that I completed, I would always make sure to feature some cinematic shots of the map to
so,
showcase
yeah.
what we had most recently completed.
One thing I
Okay.
always made sure to avoid was showing the entire map loaded in with shaders, because I wanted to save that for the end. But now with
Smart,
the series
smart.
finally over, the moment that I have been impatiently awaiting for had arrived.
It was time to
Zeig
look
bitte,
back
zeig es
over the
einfach her,
journey
komm.
that I had just
Ja,
completed
damit-
and load
möchte
the
ich sehen
map
jetzt.
with shaders.
Los, rein da. Ja? Kleine Flashbacks, aber jetzt zeig her. Los. Ich warte. Schau, wie ich mir die Hände reibe. Gott. Die Reibung macht sehr viel Hitze. Meine Hände brennen. Okay. Show me die Endergebnis. Los! Komm schon. Come on. Come on. Come on. Thanks to my friends. Los! Los! Mann! Bitte! Los! Los! And to all of you. Ah, ich bin einer von euch. Zeig her jetzt hin. Zeig her! Los! Los! Komm schon, das noch zu Ende. Dann hat er alles Flashbacks hier nochmal gezeigt. Und jetzt gehen wir. Oh, sieht das geil aus. Komm. Er geht den Berg hoch. Geh auf die Spitze. Erklimme den Berg. Und jetzt zeig es. Das ist der fucking Plot-Twist, dass dieser Scheißberg die ganze Zeit vor der Map ist, damit er von da einen Überblick hat. Geiler Plot-Twist. So, zeig er jetzt. Oh, ja. Ja. Sein PC go. Minecraft Bedrock Edition, be like die ganze Zeit. Währenddessen, wenn du das auf Java machst. Scheiß Feuermelder geht sofort an, wenn du das alles geladen hast auf der Java Edition. Geil. Richtig, richtig geil. Ja. Wahnsinn. Clap. So, und jetzt announce noch, dass du Tears of the Kingdom Map machst. Du bist ja noch lange nicht fertig, mein Lieber. Er kommt in diesen Raum rein, als wäre er gerade von fünf Schwarzen einfach in den Arsch gefickt worden. Genau so hat er diese Tür gerade aufgemacht und ist da durchgegangen. Oh, Scheiße. Jetzt setz dich hin und erzähl's mir einfach, dass es noch lange nicht das Ende ist.
Has the end of the project truly arrived? What about Tears of the Kingdom?
When Tears first released, I was 100% confident that I would be building it. But once I actually completed the game, and after going through the struggles of the Hebra region, I just wanted this project to be over. I did not want to do Tears of the Kingdom at that point, but after going through Elden and Central Hyrule, it has warmed me back up to the idea of doing Tears. It's certainly on the table, but I can't promise you that I'm going to do it. If I do end up doing a Tears project, it probably won't happen until summer 2025 at the earliest. But again, I can't promise that I'm actually going to be doing it. But as for now, with the entire Breath of the Wild map complete, I am putting it up for you guys to download for free. After all this time spent on a Minecraft world, it might be natural to wonder, what was the point of all of this? 3 years of my life were dedicated to this stupid project. I gave up college for this. I literally lost friendships partly due to this map. So what was it all for? What did I gain from doing this? The approval of thousands of strangers that I'll never meet? To watch imaginary numbers go up in my analytics? Was it all just for my own satisfaction? A result of my stubbornness to quit? Was it all just for Reddit upvotes? To an outsider, it may seem like a pointless endeavor, a complete waste of time. But once you look deeper, this project was so much more than just a Minecraft build. Because of this project, I was able to meet some of my best friends that I've even gone on to meet up with in person. I've been able to live out a dream that I've had since I was a little kid. I was able to cultivate a community of thousands of people from all over the world who met and spoke for the first time as a result of this project. This wasn't just a Minecraft build. The map acted as a stage of entertainment where my friends and I were able to make content for hundreds of thousands, even millions of people to enjoy. But this certainly is not the end. I have no intention to quit YouTube. I don't know if I'll be able to replicate the heights of this project in my future builds, but I certainly want to try. For the time being, I'll be focusing on some smaller projects that fit into a single video, similar to a couple that I've posted recently. For a lot of people who stuck around for this series, I'm sure this was just a very tiny part of your lives, a little video series that you kept up with every few months. But I know that for at least some of you guys, this project meant so much more. The fact that I was the creator of this, that I was the one who got to take you guys on this journey, is a complete honor, and I cannot thank you guys enough for sticking with me throughout these years. What I've realized through the process of making this video is that it's not just the story of the Breath of the Wild map. No, this was simply a chapter in my story, and whatever the next chapter holds, I hope that you'll stick around to find out with me.
Amen. Schöne Ansprache zum Schluss. Das war absolut fantastisch. Ich muss seit 40 Minuten ganz dringend pissen. Also wirklich sehr, sehr dringend. Also gehe ich das jetzt schnell mal an. Lasst dem Video, ich verlinke das Video und lasst ein Like bei dem Video da. Gebt dem Video hier ein Like. Keine Ahnung, macht alles. Hilfe.